So, hello everybody. Thank you very much for being here. I see the room is almost full, so it's really great for the first workshop of the School of Data Journalism 2014. My name is Antoine Laurent. I'm a senior project manager with the European Journalism Center, in charge of the organization of the School of Data Journalism here, with Milena Marin here at the front from the Open Knowledge Foundation. So the School of Data Journalism, hosted by the International Journalism Festival of Perugia, we like to say it's the biggest data journalism training event in Europe. So you might have subscribed already, registered to our scheduling tool online on datajournalismschool.net, and so you could see that we have 4 panel sessions and over or around 10 workshops with around 25 speakers this year. So we're really happy about that, because I think we somehow doubled the size of the School of Data Journalism since last year. So please don't forget to register if you haven't done it online already, because then we'll send you material from the workshops and panels by email after each workshop. For those who are not yet online, I think the password is welcome. So if you have, this should work, so if you have any problems, don't hesitate to ask me or Milena, but this should work. And apart from that, I'm very happy to introduce Steve Doig here with us since the beginning of the School of Data Journalism, so since 3 years ago you started. Steve is here for his first workshop, because you have 2 workshops here. Steve, the first workshop, From Idea to Story, Planning the Data Journalism Story. And sorry, I didn't introduce you properly. Steve, Night Chair in Journalism. I don't have the... I can talk about myself. Yeah. I know really sorry about it. I wanted to say Wizard of Computer-Assisted Reporting. Yeah. This, you let me say it. So I won't be much longer. If you have any questions, come to me or Milena here at the front, and I'll let you enjoy the workshop after this nice brainwashing we've had with our lovely advertisers and sponsors. And please enjoy.
That's on. Oh, now you can hear me well. In fact, too well. I'll stand back here. Okay, so yeah, it probably needs to be turned down slightly. Okay, we good? Yeah, can everybody hear now? And your ears are not ringing anymore. Yes, I'm delighted to be here. Can we get the first slide up there? Yeah. I've got this up here. There's a URL there, and it goes to this extremely simple page. This is the limit of my HTML coding skills right there. But on it, you'll find the PowerPoints that I'm going to use today. So those of you who are here, you can download those PowerPoints. And if you come to the spreadsheet workshop tomorrow, there's some data and some other things there. So feel free to write down the URL, even if you can't get in now. I know the Wi-Fi can be spotty. So do that, and you're welcome to use all those slides. Everybody had a chance to at least write down the URL for that? Okay, let's dive into the presentation. Not yet, okay. Steve, slow down. That's what you got to say. Okay. Let everybody write that down. Yeah, pay attention to the, let's see here. Is this thing working? I guess the little button. The tilde, you need the tilde in front of S-Doig. That's the thing that's can be confusing. And IJF is all capitals. So you have to do that too. Everybody ready? Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay.
We will send around the
Yeah. I'll put it up at the end also, so you can get it then. Again, you don't need it for this presentation, but tomorrow, if you come for the Excel workshop, it'd be good if you already had the data, the practice data. IJF 14 practice data. Have that, and then we'll go through the data tomorrow in that workshop. Okay, I've been asked to talk about data journalism, how you go from finding an idea and taking it all the way to a story. And that is something that actually would be a challenge to talk about in just the hour or so that we have here. I teach this kind of thing at my university, but I spend a whole semester to do it. So I will be taking you very quickly through the sort of the way you think about working with data stories. Again, my name is Steve Doig. I've been a data journalist. Well, I've been a journalist for I guess over 30 years. I started at a small paper in Florida, and then went to the Miami Herald in Florida, where I spent 20 years there. And then I've been a teacher for about 17 years at Arizona State University. But I started doing data journalism very early. My first computer was an Atari 800 computer that I bought back in I think it was 1981 that I bought that computer. And I bought it to start playing games and to play around with a computer. It was like a very expensive toy at the time. But at the same time, I was working as a reporter covering state government in Florida. And I began to realize that the computer would help me be a better reporter. It could help me do my job better. And that was actually important to me because I was working for the Miami Herald, which was a very competitive newsroom. I was surrounded by reporters who would go on to win Pulitzer Prizes and go on to work for the New York Times and the Washington Post and other great places. So there were a bunch of very smart reporters. And what you needed to stand out in a newsroom like that was something, a special skill that you had. And somehow or other, my special skill turned out to be working with computers and data to help tell stories. And I became a very, a passionate advocate of the idea of the importance of using data to tell stories. And so that's what I'll talk about here with you guys today. So why do data journalism at all? What's the point of it? What are we trying to do? The idea behind data journalism is it lets you go beyond just anecdotes. And the way we used to tell investigative stories particularly, let's say you wanted to do a story about the problem of drinking and driving. People who drink, drive, have accidents, and kill people. Before computers and data came along as a tool for reporters, we would find some examples of those kinds of situations, of those drinking and driving accidents. You might talk to the police or talk to judges, maybe the family of a victim, and you sort of tell a story about a couple of those accidents and then say, there's lots more of that happening, but you wouldn't really have it measured. The nice thing about data journalism is it lets you go beyond just anecdotes to actually putting evidence in your story. You still need anecdote. Anecdote is the heart of what we do. We're always telling stories based on examples of things. But actually one of the real advantages of data journalism is it often lets you find the best anecdotes. An example of that was I did a story with the Miami Herald looking at our criminal justice system. Basically, the lead of our story was Miami has more crime and less punishment than any big city in America. And as part of that story, we wanted to find an example of a day in court that would illustrate sort of the problem of it. And because I had all this data about all the different court cases that we'd had over the last 2 or 3 years, I was able to use the computer to find a particular day that showed, just how many people were being released or given very low sentences and so on. And in fact, we wound up picking a day in which one of the criminals who was released that day because there wasn't enough evidence on them went out the next day and was trying to do a robbery and wound up shooting and killing a female police officer. So as a way of kind of telling that story of the problem of justice, the computer helped us find the best anecdote for it. So to me, that's the reason to do data journalism, is to basically tell great stories and help you find what the story is in the data. Keep talking about data. What is data? It seems like a very basic thing. The way to, the light bulb should go off over your head anytime you see information that is in table form of some kind, where it's in, rows and columns of information is data. It's much harder when the data is in text, where you're trying to pull the information out of a lot of narrative. But if you see information like this, where there are columns of information and rows, no matter how many of those, you should be able to say, aha, that's data. I bet I can do things with that. And that's what we're talking about. Okay, so information in table form. So where do you find data story ideas? Where do they come from? They come from everywhere. One of the good things about for at least those of us doing data journalism, good thing about the computer revolution is all the government agencies that we cover also are using computers. They're using computers and they're gathering all their own information that way, and once the data is in a computer of some kind, we can readily take it in a variety of formats and do useful things with it. So, reporters are doing great data stories on every kind of topic, everything from weather, crime, elections, sports. Sports is a great area for doing data journalism. About half of my students all want to be sports writers. And, one of the first things I tell them is you are going into an area where you not only have, lots of data is collected, various kinds of sports statistics, but you actually have readers who care about those sports statistics. They like the math. They want to know the numbers, things like that. So almost anything that we cover produces data that we can use to analyze. So finding data stories on a beat is particularly good. Some of the best stories that I wound up working on at the Miami Herald when I was brought in to do the data work on it, those stories came out of beat reporters who were talking to their sources, who were telling them things that made us realize that we could do that story if we had the right data. And in fact, that criminal justice story I was telling you about is an example of that. Our police reporter was hearing from the police officers he was talking with. They were saying, I arrested a guy last week for armed robbery, took him in, we fingerprinted him, putting him in the jail and so on, to get ready for trial. And then he said, a week later, I arrest the same guy again. He said, how is that happening? How are these people, not getting, going through the system? How are they getting out that way? And that raised the question. We wanted to know how that was happening, and we could answer that with data. So, great place to find data story ideas is just on the beats that you already are used to covering. Other places to get ideas for data journalism stories. See what other reporters are doing. And today, thanks to the internet, there are so many different ways to kind of see the other stories that different news organizations are working on. I've always been a believer that if there is some kind of problem, social problem or a criminal activity or something like that that's going on in one city, chances are something like that is going on in your city also. So if you see a really good story that was done by another newspaper or TV station in their area, a really good idea is to start looking around to see if that same kind of problem is occurring in your area. Various places to find these kinds of things. The data-driven journalism site here, datadrivenjournalism.net. One of the great parts of this site are the lists of the stories, the featured projects that they've done, and those things are regularly updated. That way you can see what other reporters are doing in different countries, where they will wind up talking about the sources they've used and so on. So I particularly recommend datadrivenjournalism.net. Here's another good one, IRE. Some of you may know of IRE already. It's started in America, but certainly the concept of it is spread. There are now organizations all around the world that are doing the kinds of things that IRE began to do. IRE stands for Investigative Reporters and Editors. And certainly in the US, IRE became the leading training organization for data journalism. And one of the things on the IRE site, it's ire.org is the URL, is this extra extra. And extra extra is where anytime there's an investigative project of some kind, not necessarily just the really big ones, the kind that take months to do, but even quick stories that are done get posted on Extra Extra, and other reporters get to read them. My son is the investigative editor for a Newsday newspaper in New York, and he every day reads Extra Extra because it gives him ideas for things that might be going on in his area that his reporters need to be covering. So that's a particularly good source as well. The Guardian, also doing marvelous data work. And if you haven't seen their data blog, you should look at it. They do all kinds of interesting things with data. That don't always produce. It's not always investigative stories. I should add that's another. Sort of another point to make about data stories. They don't have to be big, heavy, looking into crime or social justice or things like that. There's lots of fun data stories that can be done. I'll give you an example of another place where you can find ideas for data stories just by looking at the list of databases that particular government agencies collect. Sometimes those will give you ideas. And the best example I can think of that, at least in my case, was when I was at the Miami Herald, our librarian did a public records request of all the government databases that were being collected by the local government, the Miami-Dade government. And so she wound up with this long list of 60 or 70 different databases. And I was looking down the list, and one of them was the dog license database. All the dogs in Miami had to have a dog tag. And when I looked at that, I said, that's interesting, because among the things that were in that database was not only the name of the owner and the location of where the dog lived, but also the breed of the dog and the name of the dog. And so I wound up doing a very quick kind of overnight story using the dog license database, where we could count the number of different breeds and talk about which breeds were the most popular. In Miami, it was actually Dobermans and Poodles were the two most popular for no apparent reason. We looked at the names of dogs, and we found that people aren't very creative. There were hundreds of collies named Lassie, and hundreds of bulldogs named Winston, like Winston Churchill. That kind of thing. There were a few dogs that were named after their own owner. It's like me having a dog named Steve. Come on, Steve, let's go. Why? I don't know. So I was able to, map the concentrations of different dogs and so on. And believe me, that was probably the best read data story I ever did, because everybody likes their dog or whatever. So lots of people were reading it. They're going over these lists of names and so on. It's a very popular story. So anyway, Guardian Data Blog is a great place to get good data story ideas. You also can get story ideas certainly from the usual kinds of sources that you journalists already know how to use. People who are informants or whistleblowers. Somebody who has a story to tell you and they want you to do a story. And very often an informant can be an excellent way into getting data that otherwise might be hard to get. They may be able to actually give you documents and give you databases that you can work with. And this has produced many great stories. Reading documents that are produced by government agencies is a useful thing. Not only by government agencies, but also by academics. There are people in the universities who study various kinds of social problems, and they gather data to do these things. And if you become aware of those kinds of studies, you often will have a way to learn quickly about data that can reveal very important things that you need to be aware of. And often the academic, the professor, or whoever is doing this, will be delighted to have you work with them on the story, because normally people don't pay that much attention to academic research, just other academics do. But the idea of having a news organization pay attention to their work and so on will make them very happy, and they'll be very likely to help you. So read those documents, study the documents, learn the databases that different agencies keep. Read those academic reports, including the footnotes and the bibliography. That will lead you to good, interesting data sources. Pardon me. Here's the process that I go through when I am trying to create a data story, and it's basically the idea behind it is you work backwards. You start out with the idea of your story. I want to do a story on the problems of crime in my area. Okay, so that's going to be your basic thing. But then you start thinking, okay, what kind of statements would I like to make in my story? Things like, I'll go through them in a second, but basically there are various kinds of things that you would like to make, kind of bullet points that you would like to make. So once you know the statements you want to make, then you'll say, what kind of variables do I need to be able to make those statements? And then you would say, who would collect data that would include those variables? And then finally you would start to think, okay, how do I get that data from the person who does the collecting? Okay, so you're basically working backwards. You're almost thinking of what the end product, what your actual final story is going to be like before you even know what data you have. So you work backwards. Let's go through that. So the lead of a story like this is probably going to be your hypothesis. Your hypothesis might be, crime is getting worse in my area, okay? And then you would realize that if I was going to start out a story saying, crime is a problem here, we would want to have, several key points that we would make, the bullet points, the statements. And if you were doing that crime and court story, it might be things like, crime is increased by X amount. Okay, you don't even know what the X is yet. You haven't studied the data, but you know you want to be able to make that statement, and you'll learn what the X is once you have a chance to study the data. Or the amount of crime per 100,000 people in such and such a city is the worst in our area. That might be a statement you want to make in there. Or only a certain percentage of crimes actually ever get somebody arrested. All those kinds of things are statements you would like to make. Even though you don't know what those numbers will be, those are things that you would want to say in this story. Okay? So you say, now I have an idea. I've actually written down some of those statements. Now, what variables do I need to be able to make those statements, to fill in those numbers? And you start thinking again in terms of the table of information that might give you what you need. Once again, the columns will be your variables, And the rows will be your individual cases, whether the rows are particular people who are arrested or statistics for different cities or whatever it is that you're looking at, crime reports or something like that. Realize that there are two different kinds of variables that you're mostly interested in. One are the so-called categorical variables. These are the ones that are things like the gender, the sex, the name of the city, the zip code, the postal code, the type of crime. Is it a murder or a robbery or whatever? All those kinds of things basically are variables that have labels on them. Those would be the categorical variables. And then there are numeric variables. These are the sort of measurement variables, the counts, the number of crimes, the cost of things, the size of the population, whatever else, the number of accidents, the number of arrests. All those would be numerical variables. So once you get that idea of the two different kinds, you then start thinking of, okay, what variables do I need to be able to do my crime and court story? So in that case, we know we would need, among the variables would be the kind of crime, because we wanted to be able to count, how many murders, how many robberies, how many car thefts, all those were going on. We would want the population of the places where these crimes were happening, so we could make a direct comparison of different sized places. We would want the date of the crime, the time it happened, the location where it happened, the number of victims, perhaps, the amount of money stolen, was an arrest made, a yes/no question, perhaps. All those kinds of things would be variables that we would need to be able to do these, to make the statements that we've already decided we want to do. Then we have to say, okay, who collects those kinds of variables? And like I told you before, the good thing about this age of working with data journalism is all the agencies that we are covering, all types of government, plus corporations and so on, are all collecting lots and lots of information. So it's not like we have to create it ourselves. Back when I was starting doing data journalism, for instance, I did back when Miami was the murder capital of the United States. Yay, we're number one. Back in the early 1980s, when there was shootouts in the street and so on, I did a project looking at murder in Miami, and we had something like 300. It was nearly a murder a day through the course of the year in Miami. So I gathered a database of all the murders, but I couldn't just go to the police and say, give me a copy of the database, because back then everything was on paper. So I wound up having to get copies of the case reports of the more than 300 murders, bring them home, type them into my own computer, into my own spreadsheet, and so on. So it took a lot of work to create the kind of thing I needed to do that story. Today, it's much easier, at least in terms of the typing stuff in. That is much more rare now, because generally the information that we want for stories is already being gathered. Even better, the agencies that gather the information are doing that for bureaucratic reasons. They all too often are not using it to analyze. So we often are the ones who are discovering the interesting things in their data. They don't even know what's in their data. So it's great for reporters. We find stories they don't even know are sitting in there. So all government agencies, here you see a word cloud of various government agencies, but they're all collecting various kinds of things. You might have to go to several different ones. If you're doing that crime and court story, you may need information from the police, information from the court system, perhaps information from the prison system, census information, so you can get populations and things like that. So all kinds of different places you might have to go to get the information, the variables that you need. Then you face the problem of actually getting the data, okay? And the one thing I always hear when I come to Europe to talk about these stories is how lucky it is we're in the United States, where all we have to do is pick up the telephone and call a government agency, and they send a limousine over immediately to hand us our data. It's not actually that easy. But we do have, certainly in the United States, we do have pretty strong public records laws. All too often we have to go to court to enforce those. We still run into agencies that try to keep what should be public information, keep that private, or try to charge a lot of money for us to get that information. But I have to say that in the years I've been coming to Europe to talk about this, it has gotten a lot better for you too. The European Union has at least passed public records laws that, at least on paper, look good. And from what I see of the data journalism being done by news organizations in Europe, more and more reporters are actually getting their hands on good data. They're fighting for it and getting it. So that's the real trick, using the public records laws, getting those documents, downloading it, and so on. There are various kinds of places to get help and information. Here in Europe, the wobbing.eu, I think is this site up here. Wob. Yeah, if you Google wobbing, W-O-B-B-I-N-G, it will lead you to a number of great resources for doing public records requests from governments here in Europe. In the United States, our equivalent to the wobbing laws are the Freedom of Information Act. This is for federal information. And down at our state and local levels, we have various kinds of sunshine laws and public records laws and so on. In the United States, it is kind of catch-all. Some states are very open, where people have passed laws and constitutional amendments even to make it clear that the information belongs to the public, that we've already paid for it to be gathered. Our tax dollars are being used to gather this information. Therefore, it belongs to us, the public, is the argument that we make. So use those tools to get the information that you need. Be polite but persistent. Because actually the first time you make the request of a government agency for that information, they'll say, "Oh, well, that can't be done," or "Oh, the guy who has that information is on vacation this month and you can't get it." And but that's when you turn and say, "Well, what if the premier or the director of the agency said they needed that information right now? How would you get it?" There are various kinds of arguments you can make to get around the attempts to limit your access to public information. Another thing that can be scary to people who are starting out to get data is the data formats. Even if you have an agency that is willing to give it to you, then they might start saying something like, "Well, what kind of format do you want it in? Do you want it to be ASCII, EBCDIC, XLSX, DBase? What do you want? What do you want?" And if you are not expert already or familiar with those different formats, don't be intimidated. One thing you have to know is let's say you want to work with this data in Microsoft Excel, what we'll talk about tomorrow, which is a great tool that will handle almost any kind of data problem you're likely to run into. But you don't have to get from the government agency their data in a Microsoft Excel format, because Excel can actually open up a variety of different formats. And there are other programs that will translate from whatever format it's into something that you can get it into Excel. So don't be intimidated by that. The thing to do is to find yourself a data nerd, somebody like me. Okay, and this is what I tell my students. You basically want to have your nerd talk to their nerd, and then the two nerds can come up with a solution that'll work for you. So even if you don't know all the secret language and all that, you'll be able to get it. One place to find good nerds, in fact, is on some of these email lists. In the United States and with a number of foreign journalists who also are active in it, is a list called NICAR-L, N-I-C-A-R-L, NICAR-L. And it's the list where data journalists talk about the problems they're running into. So somebody can, let's say a new data journalist can post a question saying, "I've been told I can only have it in this format. Is this going to be a problem? And then somebody else, somebody like me, within minutes will be posting an answer saying, here's what to tell them, yes, you can take that, here's how to turn it into what you want. So there's lots of help out there, even if you aren't an expert yet. So don't let that intimidate you. Yes? For NICARL, yes, it's a listserv. It's NICAR-L. And you can sign up to NICARL if you go to ire.org. Okay? Data-driven journalism is the other list I was going to recommend, the DDJ list. If you do Google for data-driven journalism, you'll find the list there that is excellent. Bunch of really good data journalists who will talk about it.
And just to say that I'm taking notes, and we'll circulate the notes with all these links included. So you'll have all the resources.
Yeah, and I'll put a list of these kinds of URLs on that same website I gave, so you can download that too. Okay. Yeah, but the DDJ list is very good, and there you're hearing not just Europeans, but actually people all over the world talking about data stuff. It's become a real resource. One thing to watch out for. Here is one format that try to avoid getting, and this is the PDF format. Okay, the public document format that Adobe has. The problem with PDF is it looks great, it's very readable and so on, but it doesn't import well into other things. And actually right now on the NICARL list today was a long string of messages about somebody who had gotten a 5,000-page document, file, 5,000 pages of PDFs about jailed inmates or whatever. And it turns out it's an ugly PDF format that can't readily be converted and so on. PDFs are a real problem. If, however, the only thing they will give you is a PDF, and sometimes you run into that, there are some conversion utilities that for at least many PDFs will turn it into data that you can actually get into Excel. Things like Acrobat Pro actually sometimes, if it is a properly created PDF, will export it out into something. And sites like Zamzar and Comet Docs also will do those conversions, generally. But PDFs, the aggravating thing about PDFs is agencies that give you a PDF and say this is all we have, almost always they are, for instance, are using an Excel spreadsheet. They have their data on an Excel spreadsheet, but when they save the data for you, they're just hitting the save as PDF. It would be just as easy for them to do save as XLS, but for a variety of reasons, sometimes just to try and make it harder for you, they will do that. So avoid PDFs if you can. Let's see how we're doing on time. We're okay. You have your data. Okay. Let's say you actually got your hands on your data. What do you do now? Okay. So let's assume you got it. You downloaded it. They gave it to you on a thumb drive or on a DVD or something like that. Now what do? First thing you need to do is see, are there going to be any problems with the data? Does it have to be cleaned up? I have a hat that I got from a friend who worked in information technology. They had a softball team, and the hat on it, the name of their team was Dirty Data. And dirty data is a problem for anybody that works with data that hasn't been standardized, hasn't been cleaned up. The example I always use about dirty data that we run into all the time in the United States is when we get campaign finance information. In the United States, the politicians have to file information on all the money they collect to run their campaigns. It's a great resource. The trouble with that is it's all been typed in by volunteers. And even things as simple as the names of cities will be misspelled regularly. I've seen, for instance, the city of Phoenix that I live in, is spelled not only P-H-O-E-N-I-X, but I've seen, P-H-E-O-N-I-X. I even once saw F-E-E-N-I-X. Who would have even thought that? So you have to figure out, what's wrong with the ones that are misspelled so that you can aggregate them eventually. If you want to be able to say, how much money came from people who gave in the city of Phoenix, you got to get all those misspellings turned into the correct spelling. That's what we mean by cleaning dirty data. If you look at genders and you have more than 2, you probably got dirty data that you got to clean up. That kind of thing. So looking to see the problems that are in there. One of the reasons that you wind up with dirty data is the people who collect data are doing it for bureaucratic reasons, okay? And for the purposes, for instance, of the campaign finance laws, it doesn't really matter to them how well things are spelled. It all kind of evens out to them. But we want the data for analysis reasons. We have to be more precise than they are. So that's why you need to clean it up. And there are various tools for doing that kind of cleanup. One of the best is, you can see this nice big diamond icon. It's called Open Refine. It actually used to be Google Refine. Google bought the little operation that had created this. But it's a tool that will pull in your dirty data set. It will give you an idea of how many things need to be changed. It will actually go through and make guesses about, let's say, all those different misspellings of Phoenix, put them all together. It'll give you a way to click and say, this is the one I want all these changed into, and with just the click of the button, you can do it. So Open Refine is a very powerful tool to use. You can Google that, Open Refine, R-E-F-I-N-E, and it's a free download JavaScript program. It'll run on Mac or PC. Very good tool. It has programming built into it as well. But even this kind of cleaning can be done with other kinds of tools. A good text editor like Text Wrangler or Notepad++. You can do things like search and replace just to fix problems. Even with Excel, if you pulled in dirty data with Excel, sorted, for instance, by the city name and then started going down the list, you would see the misspelled ones at least. So you could kind of quickly eyeball your way down. It's slower than using something like Refine, but all those things need to be done to clean up, and those kinds of tools would help you do it. Now you've got clean data. What are you doing with this? The best explanation I've ever been able to come up with for how we do data journalism is we are looking for patterns. We're looking for the highs and the lows, the range, the minimums and the maximums. We're looking for the averages and the medians. We want to get in our mind kind of the shape of the data. Even better, what we want are outliers. Outliers are the instances that are very different from everything else. And in fact, those, outliers are where we journalists love. The way the rest of the world works is, that's kind of boring. We like the ones that are the most and the least and the best and the worst. That's the places where our stories come from. So many kinds of stories have been discovered by doing, even something as simple as sorting and so on. Easy things that I'll talk about tomorrow in the Excel session can show you the ones that are behaving differently from everybody else. The city with a crime problem that's much worse than all the others. Or if everybody else's crime is going down a little bit, but one is going up. That's where your story is. Why is that one behaving differently? So that's what I mean by looking for patterns. Find those ones that are different. One of the recent stories that I worked on as a consultant with an investigation group in California, we were looking at a chain of hospitals in California that we were getting tips that the hospital administrators were ordering the doctors there to use special codes for the diagnoses that they were giving their patients. And basically what we were being told is they were turning kind of normal medical conditions into dramatic ones, very dangerous medical conditions, because the government would pay more for patients who had those conditions. And so we wanted to know, is that true? Were they, is this chain of hospitals actually doing this in a way that could be detected? So we got a big database of all the diagnoses of all the patients that had been in, all the California hospitals over 5 years, and then by using a computer, we were able to see that, if we sorted by the percentage of patients who were being diagnosed with these particular dire and dramatic illnesses, Were they spread through all hospitals evenly, or were some much more than others? And happily for our story, yes, of the top 10 hospitals that were finding these particular kinds of diagnoses, it was like 8 of the 10 of them were all this chain of hospitals. And the rates that they were doing at it was so dramatically higher than the average for the entire state that it became obvious what they were doing. Even more obvious was after we started writing these stories saying that they were doing this, when the next year's data came out, that particular thing disappeared entirely. They weren't doing it anymore, and it became obvious from the data that way too. So looking for the patterns in the data is how you do these stories. Excel, as I said, is probably the go-to tool. It's certainly the gateway drug for doing data journalism. I'll put it that way. Once you start seeing what Excel will do for you, you will realize that 80 to 90% of any story that you're going to do in data journalism, you probably can use Excel to do it. Excel these days will hold as many as about 1 million records in it. It'll hold thousands of variables. You almost never run into anything with more than a few dozen variables, but Excel will hold all that. And Excel has sort of simple tools that will let you do these kinds of things: sorting, filtering, creating new variables with functions, and then pivot tables. And I will talk about all those things tomorrow, so consider this an ad for tomorrow's session. So those Excel tools will help you do that pattern finding that I'm talking about. Another tool that you have to use is your brain, and particularly math and statistics. I see out in the audience little beads of blood appearing on people's forehead right now. You're squinting, horrible. I know this scares a lot of people, seeing something like this, but in reality, the math and statistics that reporters need to know, math and statistics, but it's pretty much like this, okay? It's not this scary stuff, it's this, okay. You're really talking about, add, subtract, multiply, divide. Every once in a while, you might hit a square root button. That's it. Okay, but you have to be good at that. Or at least you have to be accurate at that. You have to, I'll put it this way. I was called professor years before I went into the university because in the Miami Herald newsroom, I could do percentage change. Other reporters couldn't. So I would have people who are going on to win Pulitzers come to me and say, does the big number go on the top or the little number? They had no idea what to do. So, being terrified of math is not should not be a reason to become a reporter, though it has been for many of us. When I was in college, I took freshman calculus, got a barely passing grade, never took any more math or statistics, and then I spent much of the rest of my journalism career trying to painfully teach myself what I could have learned in a good semester class of statistics. And even sadder, I now teach statistics, so that's, I guess, some indictment of something or other. So anyway, you do have to use a certain amount of math because the math helps you tell that story. You do want to see, what the outliers are, and you do want to be able to calculate averages and so on. I do have something to help you. You can barely read this, but it's I call it a newsroom math cheat sheet or crib sheet. It's 1 page, okay? It really has all the math that you need to know. And I put it on that same website. It's down on there. So you are free to download that. It will show you how to do percentage change so you can be called professor in your newsroom too. So be sure and get that. It takes you through, averages and so on. It'll even talk about how to count crowds. That's an important skill as well. So 1 page newsroom math cheat sheet. Feel free to download that. Here's a quick commercial for the Excel session tomorrow, right in this same room at 11:30. I will take anybody who's here through an exercise using some data that I have gathered that you can follow along and do those things and see how stories can be pulled out of, it's basically some crime data, some accident data, and so on. Okay? So I look forward to seeing you here. Here's another resource. The European Journalism Center gathered together 5 instructors, myself and 4 others, scattered internationally, to talk about different aspects of data journalism. The thing I'm doing, not surprisingly, is the Excel session. But this is a free MOOC, one of those massively open online courses. And go to the European Journalism Center site. Again, you can find all this stuff using Google, or we'll pull up the URLs for you. Yeah, we'll get that. I think there's still time to sign up because this starts in about 2 weeks. It's online. Each week you will do, it's over 5 weeks, so each week will be a different module. You'll see 4 different videos done by, people like myself and Simon Rogers and Alberto Cairo and Nicholas Kaiserbell and others. I've forgotten who the other couple are offhand. I can't come up with it. But anyway, it's a good way to learn all these things. Want to throw? Yeah. You want to use this one? Here you go.
So thanks for this mentioning the MOOC. We have now 17,000 people who registered to the MOOC, so you can join them. It's starting in 2 weeks. So
it's like every data journalist in the world, or wannabe, is in it. So make sure you're part of it as well if you do it. It's good, and again, you will be getting not only the sort of video instruction, but there will be downloads of things to read and so on. So I would say take a look at that. Let's talk about doing a data journalism story. What do you do with it? You found the patterns that are in it. Too many people who are starting out with data journalism think that the data is everything in the story, and they sort of see the data journalism story as a whole bunch of numbers. And in fact, people who aren't doing data journalism kind of dismiss it as that. It's like, who wants to read a story filled with numbers? That's not true at all with data journalism. Good data journalism stories can hang on one number sometime, the outlier that you found. You use that to then build a full story. So the data journalism elements, most of the stuff that goes into a data journalism story is things you already know how to do. Okay? It's, talking to sources, reading documents, getting people to tell you stories, getting photographs, getting audio interviews, videography, all those elements are part of data journalism stories. The data, in fact, may be the smallest piece of it all. The best way to deal with data, if you do in fact want to use a lot of numbers, is to break it out. Have a list on the side. You don't put that in the middle of your story. That in fact would slow the story down. You break it out on the side. You put it on the web. You let it be interactive so people can explore and find the examples that fit their situation, fit their life. They want to look up, how crime is in their neighborhood and so on. Those are all ways to deal with it. And your overall story can actually be a well-crafted one. You need a team to do good data journalism stories. Obviously, you need you, the person who gathered the data and who's done the analysis and so on. But many data stories, particularly when they start becoming big, require other reporters. You bring in other skills to help tell that story. In my case, when I worked at the Miami Herald, I was the one who was really good with working with the data, but we had other reporters who were, certainly better than I was at, for instance, getting people to talk to them and have the patience to go through, thousands of pages of documents and things like that. I don't have that kind of patience, and so on. So bringing in other reporters, good editors who can help you focus your story and, help you find, the story that you really want to tell. And then you need all the other things that go with a good story, the graphic artists and the interactive web design and anything else like that, good photos and so on. That's all part of a data story. And again, it's stuff that you already know how to do. So even if you're here and you're trying to learn a little bit about what this data journalism is like, one thing to know is it's not just, you hit a button and suddenly data journalism story appears. That data analysis portion is only the first step towards a good data journalism story. But again, most of those other steps you already probably got a pretty good idea about. One more commercial for what's going on here. As Antoine said at the beginning, we have a variety of workshops going on over the next 2 or 3 days, so make sure you look in your your program to see the different things that are being offered. And you'll find things on mapping, on other ways of thinking about data, security, and so on, plus, again, my thing on Excel tomorrow. So let's see, I think that's my last commercial here. So it's time for questions. Anybody want to ask any questions? Questions, anybody? Yes, sir. Back.
Can you show the website again?
I will. A good idea. There you go. Other question? Yes, sir.
Can it be misleading if you have kind of a hypothesis?
Hypothesis.
Yeah, that's what I wanted
right.
to say.
Good.
And then you get to the data, and because as we all know, you can wrangle data as long as you have the statement you wanted to have to say.
That's a good point. What happens when you have a hypothesis and it turns out to be not true? At the Herald, we used to call that another good story ruined by over-reporting. But sometimes that actually is a good story, because if you had that hypothesis, then probably lots of other people in town were saying things like, crime is getting worse, because I heard about something like that. But if you then got the data and did the analysis and it showed that it isn't, that can be, a story that proves what other people are thinking is wrong. That's a good story too. Sometimes the hypothesis, well, I'll give you an example of this. In the city of Philadelphia a few years ago, the new crime statistics that were coming out were showing that crime was going down. Fewer robberies and things like that. And the police were saying, we're doing a great job. But reporters for the Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper started looking into those numbers, and through a variety of methods, including data journalism, what they discovered were the police were changing crimes into lesser things. They were turning rapes into purse snatchings and so on, which had the equivalent of making the crime statistics look good. So they were just lying about it and then claiming that they were doing a great job. So when the Inquirer did the story about this, they also put in there a database of the listings of the different crimes that had happened to people. And they told people, if you had a crime that happened to you, look it up in here and tell us if what they have in here is what happened to you. And they got hundreds of reports from people who were able to even give them more stories about the things the police were doing. So, it's always good to have a hypothesis. And the fact that the hypothesis doesn't come out to be true that's not a problem. It is a problem if you cheat the statistics. You can say, well, we'll ignore this part of it and make it happen. Then you're not playing fair. You don't want to do that. I agree. Yes, sir. Let's get that so I can hear.
How many times it happened that you are not able to demonstrate your theory, and then it could be that it's simply a wrong theory, but also that you were looking for the wrong data? How do you deal with this issue?
Pretty much like I was saying before. I mean, if you have if you know the data is correct, and that's a problem. In the Philadelphia case, the data actually was incorrect. But if you know the data was correct, and you are finding that the data is not telling you what you thought the story was, you either do a story saying, despite what everybody thinks, crime is not getting worse, or whatever, or you look at it and you say, there isn't a story there. That can happen. One advantage, by the way, of data journalism is if you have the data and you do the analysis and it shows that the story that you thought was there is not there, you probably have not invested very much time. If you tried back in the old days before we had data, you might have to read thousands of documents and talk to a whole bunch of people to discover that there wasn't a story there. It takes you more time to find out that that the story wasn't there. Another thing let me add about data journalism. Once you have the data, the least amount of time you're going to spend on the story is the actual data analysis. It doesn't take long. With Excel, if you have it in a spreadsheet, you sort, you create a pivot table, there's your pattern, okay? The biggest story I ever worked on, I'm sure, was the hurricane in Miami. It's the one the Herald won the Pulitzer Prize for. The aftermath of Hurricane Andrew. The key part of our story was the finding that the newer the home, the more likely it was to be destroyed, was the key thing that came out of the data. I got that part of the story in an afternoon. Once we had the data, I ran it through the computer, pulled up the frequency table, there was the lead of our story. So I didn't have to put in lots of work to discover that we did have a story in that case, that there was a pattern that we could hang it on. But the same thing works the other way. If it's not there, it's just not there, and you can move on to another story. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Does it mean you can't be surprised by things that are in the data? You can't really break news?
Oh, absolutely, you can break news. One thing I always do whenever I get a data set for one particular kind of story, I then dig through the data set to see if there are other things that will tell me that will be good stories. The data set that I used for Hurricane Andrew was the property tax roll, basically a listing of all the property in Miami and the amount of value of it and so on. I used that not only for Hurricane Andrew, but then started playing around with it and discovered that we could tell a story about how the property appraiser's office was undervaluing high-priced homes, which essentially is a tax break for rich people. Just again I thought, gee, let me take a look at it and see if there's a pattern there. So yes, it can. You can break stories certainly using data. Did that answer that sort of? Okay. Other questions? We got a few more minutes before we got a break. So good.
On your opinion, in this job, it's more important to be a well journalist, a man who know how to tell a story, how to attract curiosity from people, or it's more important to is a very math and statistics addicted who know how to fit data and stories.
Yeah, what is more important? The most important thing is to be a good journalist, to be able to recognize a story. And the point on data journalism is it's just one way to tell stories. It's one way to find stories. And I'm not saying, I don't believe that all journalists ought to be like me. A newsroom filled with Steve Doigs would not work. There are skills that I don't have that other people do have. So, whatever skills you have, those are the things that you bring to it. I guess I'm here to say about data journalism is it isn't as hard as some people think it is. Again, it's like I said with the math, 1 plus 1 equals 2. So you don't have to be a statistician, you just have to know, enough to be able to count things. And that's really all we're mostly doing with data journalism. But the more important part of being a data journalist, the important word in data journalism is journalism, not data, is the way I think about it. Any other questions? Okay, yes. I could say up until the late 1990s, I knew how to do everything that was being done in data journalism. But in 1997, 98, somewhere around in there, it started expanding out. And so today, data journalism is like a really big tent, and there are people who, there are very few people who can do all of the things that are in there, and I certainly can't. I'm very much on the end of the analysis end. I've got a whole variety of tools that help me study patterns in data. On the other far end are the people who are expert in the presentation side of it, who can do web design and create interactive graphics and things like that. As far as I'm concerned, all of that is data journalism. Okay, it's just different ways of telling the story. And to do it really well, like the New York Times or the Guardian or whatever are doing, you need people with a whole variety of these skills brought together that way. So, so I guess the answer is whatever skills you bring to data journalism are probably going to be useful in some way or other. And if you have an affinity for it, if it resonates with you, you will probably pick up some of the other skills. I mean, again, I'll never be a web designer, but I certainly can look at my data and come up with ideas to give to the web designer, saying, here are ways that I think we could make a good interactive database or something like that. So your skills will expand the more of the stuff you do. Anything else? I think we're near the end of the time. They want to be able to change the next one. Okay, thank you for your attention. I hope to see many of you tomorrow. Bye-bye.